Welcome to the Fourthstream podcast, where we are dedicated to finding hope. You can count on us to do our research and invite you into a dynamic learning process of authenticity. You can find lots of hopeful resources at fourthstream.com.
There's a term that people use, a lot of religious people have used, that's called revival. And revival's an interesting concept. It's an interesting term. You associate, like I said, kind of with religious things, but it talks about things lost that are found again. So that's one backdrop of today's conversation, is the idea of something being brought back from being lost. A second concept that kind of goes along with it is the one of awakening. And that's kind of like things yet to be found. So an awakening is coming awake to something that you don't know, that you've not experienced. A revival is a return to things that are lost. And then there's also a concept that's interesting, particularly in the God story, and it talks about the idea of rain. And God is the provider of rain, and we experience this rain from heaven, and it impacts us in God-reliant kinds of things. So these are like broad concepts, revival, things lost; awakening, things yet to be found; rain, God-reliant things. And that's what I want to talk about today, and what that looks like in a person's life. Now, when a person is asleep, or at least that would be the metaphor that I think the God story would use, and I think psychologists would use it, and I think counselors, a lot of different people. The idea of when you are asleep versus being awake. There are a lot of reasons to be asleep. I don't know what when you go to sleep. I usually look at my bed and I go, I can't wait to get in there, because I want to move on from the busyness of being awake to being able to be asleep and to rest. And so there's that concept. But then there's also the idea of sleep when it comes to insulation, because we want to be insulated from things that are pressing on us and that are difficult. So we like to be asleep. So when a person is asleep, we have reasons to be asleep. So we often enjoy this protective slumber, because it protects us from things in our mind and things that we're experiencing in our heart and our emotions, and resting in the midst of that. So that's one aspect of being asleep, enjoying protective slumber. The second one is when you think about being asleep or being awake, often people who are asleep don't know. So there's the kind of sleep that we choose, and then there's the kind of sleep that we don't know about, but we are asleep just by virtue of the nature of who we are. We're asleep to things that we don't want to deal with, or that we're not awakened to in some way, shape, or form. And then the third area when it comes to a person being asleep is that we often embrace pain-free living. And this is more of an intentional kind of a sleep where we don't want to experience pain. There are a lot of turbulent, painful things about life, and sometimes you feel like you can only take so much. So you embrace pain-free living, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. But that idea often of thought-free avoidance. There are just things I choose not to think about because I want to be asleep, because I want to be insulated from the implications of the weighty things that I see around me, or the things that I'm experiencing in my life. Now, there are many aspects to being asleep as a person, and I'd just like to look at a few of those today. First of all, mentally, we can be drowsy or slumbering. I like the word drowsy because it's that whole, you're kind of drifting off, or slumbering. And this can happen by neglect or laziness, or just a lack of engaging, just kind of being neutral toward the things that are going on around me. So mentally, I can be drowsy or slumbering, neglect, laziness, lack of engaging. So there can be a mental sleepiness. There's also an emotional sleepiness that I've observed in my life as well as the lives of other people. And we can shut down because of historical or recent hurts or challenges, and we do it in self-preservation to cover up our pain. So we can sleep mentally, but we can also sleep emotionally. And even though we may be awake and our eyes are working and people can see us and we're interacting and we're going about our work, we put our emotions on hold and go to sleep. And this can happen, in a lot of different phases of a person's life. The next area that we can go to sleep as a person is physically. And this is something that we often mostly have no control over. Like I have my right ear right now, I don't know what's going on with it, but it's just that maybe I've overused it. Too much rock music over the years, but basically I can feel it going to sleep. And so I need to go get it checked out and find out about that. I've got a place on my left leg down by my ankle that about 2 years ago, and it's a nerve thing, so it started going to sleep. So parts of our body can cease to work correctly, and that impacts our physical health, but it also impacts how we feel about life and how we feel about ourselves. And then also when it comes to sleep, there is the idea of spiritual sleep. And we can be asleep and I like this word because atrophy is basically what happens when you don't use something. It's what happens to people after they've been bedridden and they've had some kind of an illness, and as that illness has happened, they haven't been very mobile, and your muscles can just kind of shut down. And so spiritually, we can be asleep, meaning like never awake, or we can also atrophy because we once were awake, but because we haven't used those spiritual muscles, we haven't pursued soul things, we atrophy and we don't move forward in that part of our life. So mentally, emotionally, physically, and spiritually are all different aspects of sleep that humans can experience in different ways. Now, there are a couple of things. Moses is one of my favorite God story characters. He had a lot to say. He wrote just a couple of Psalms, and one of them that came from Moses is in Psalm 90. And I think about this when I think about my personal God goals. So this is just a couple verses out of Psalm 90. It says, "As for the days of our life, they contain 70 years. Or, if due to strength, 80 years. Yet their pride is but labor and sorrow. Yet soon it's gone, and we all fly away. So teach us, Lord, to number our days that we may present to you a heart of wisdom." So, I know people want to live until we're 100 or 120, and we think that medicine is going to pull that off. And, we'll see. That mankind is capable of some pretty amazing things. But when it comes to the idea of the number of days, by and large, it's like a 70, 80-year thing. And if you get 5 or 7, but you know as well as I do, most people, by and large, when you go from that, when you get past 80, and I watched it happen with my parents, quality of life really starts going down. So you might end up with more years. You may live to your 90. I've seen some pretty sharp 90 and even 95-year-old people. But that whole idea that we have numbered days, we can't get away from that. And that's part of what we're looking at when we are thinking about this idea of sleep and slumber and being awake. And so that leads me to my goal. And I think it's God's goal, actually, for every person. It's to be awake to God for as many of my days as I can. So I don't want to just put in my time. I don't want to just put in my 80 years or my 90 years or my 100 years. I want to be awake to God for as many days as I can be, so that I can be awake to life as much as I can be. So that means being awake to what I do and how I do it and who I know, what I pursue with my life. And so in order to stay awake, I need to engage as much of my being as possible in the great, and we've talked about this before, scientific and philosophical and faith questions of life. And the more I'm engaging and continuing to be a learner and continuing to be a person who embraces, I can achieve that goal of being awake to as many of the God things as I possibly can. Which kind of leads me to, well, it does. It leads me to another passage, which this is in Acts chapter 17, and this is cool because you got the Apostle Paul. He's not standing and talking to a bunch of Jews. He's talking in Athens on the Areopagus. So these people are looking at him like that he's out of his mind. But he's explaining to us about this idea of engaging the most we possibly can and the best that we possibly can. And he says, and God made from one man every nation of mankind to live on all the face of the earth, having determined their appointed times and the boundaries of their habitation. So that's what I'm experiencing in my life. And everybody's experiencing it. I have boundaries. I didn't decide when I was born, and by and large, I have no choice over when I'm going to die. That they would seek God if perhaps they might grope for Him and find Him, though He is not far from each one of us. For in Him we live and move and exist. And then he goes on to talk about the divine nature. So again, my goal is God's goal. I want to be awake. This whole allotment of my days and the allotment of my years, I want to be able to embrace my life to the fullest measure that I possibly can, because my days are numbered. My eternity is not necessarily, but that's a question for another time. So that kind of returns me to some questions we have been pondering, woven all the way through this particular series. The first one, why am I here? And that idea that ultimate meaning is meant to be contemplated. And these are questions that are not necessarily always answerable. I was listening to Jordan Peterson, went and saw him speak here in our city a couple of days ago. And the idea that it's the process. It's the process of these questions. Why am I here? Can I answer that? I don't know, but I can certainly think about ultimate meaning, and then I can contemplate it. So that's an important question that can keep me awake, like I was just talking about. The second one is kind of relates to, is there a God, and has God revealed Himself? And again, it's a good question. Is it really answerable? Well, there are a lot of great religions of the world where people ponder this and try to answer it for a lifetime. I mean, do we ultimately know if this question is even answered until the end of our lives, until those numbered days are over? I don't think that we necessarily do. But this question, has God revealed Himself? If God has spoken, then it seems important to embrace what God has said, right? Doesn't that make sense? So why am I here? And has God revealed Himself? And there's two other questions that I think are really important for me to not necessarily answer, but for me to wrestle with and ponder. The third one is, do I have a soul? I sense my mind. I think I understand my heart. My body is pretty obvious to me. I get the idea of my conscience a little bit, the idea of a spirit of a man. But do I have a soul? Is there an intrinsic part of me that is the essence of who I am? And answering the question, is there more to my life than what I can just see and experience? Is there more to me? Is there more to my life? Is there more to my meaning? And that is good for me. It's good for me to think about that, and it's good for me to ponder that, because it keeps me awake, and it keeps me alive, and it keeps me growing towards something greater than myself. And then finally, this is one of the great questions of life for me, and I ponder it all the time. Will there be an inhabitable, never-ending heaven? I mean, obviously, the God story and different writings of religion talk about different viewpoints on what that is. So my question is, can the hope of something beyond this life be quantified and then defined in a satisfactory way? All of those questions help keep me awake, and that's why I bring them up to you. And they reflect on several things for me, and that may be helpful to you, because if I want to come alive to or wake up to greater things, there are several things that are important to cultivate, I think, in a human life, in a life of a person that wants to find the most we can. And the first one is the want to. The want to of life must be addressed. What is it that you want out of life? What are you reaching for? What are you searching for? And that that could be defined as drive. What are the things that drive you? What are the things that motivate you? So the want to is huge, because if you don't have the want to, where's the drive going to come from? And we all have different levels of drive for different things, right? So the second part of this waking up is the how to has got to be investigated. And how does this happen? And how does a person wake up? And how do you awaken to a compass that's probably outside of yourself? Part of it might be in yourself, but part of it is outside of yourself. So how do you awaken to the how to? Because the want to is important, but the how to is important, because that's where a satisfied mind comes from. If you are pursuing something that really is meaningful and useful to your soul, as well as in the greater scheme of things. And then the next thing is that the great questions really need to be contemplated. We just looked at 4 of those. There are many great questions. And again, it's the contemplation. This is how we wake up. This is how we come alive, because we contemplate these great questions, and we look at the how-to of what it means to pursue things that are greater. And then we also look at the want-to. And that leads to the 4th thing that I think we need to pay attention to when we're thinking about coming alive or waking up. And that's that opiates must be avoided. And I call this the sleepy dream. This is the kind of the nature of human life where we just fall asleep. It's not like we try to fall asleep. We just do. Some of us try to fall asleep, but some of it just happens. And opiates are just a huge thing for us. And we're going to talk about that again just for a second. But when it comes to Jesus and the words of Jesus, he basically clarified this, and he said that he was the life. He's bringing life, but he says, hey, I am the way and the truth and the life. And he came for us so that we could be fully alive, as John Eldredge says, or fully awake. That's what Jesus wants for us. And the hard thing about that is, because of the opiate-rich environment we live in, and I want to just go through this list really quickly. And when you think about the opiates, and I'm looking at my list right here, and I don't have religion on here, but obviously religion is one of the opiates as well. Alcohol and drugs, social media, gossip and strife, and how much, just think of our news media and what that sucks up into our lives, and what social media takes from our available minutes and our available hours, or we give it to it, it doesn't take it. Food and gluttony. I personally experienced diabetes, which is now under control, but I think about the sugar gluttony that I experienced for so much of my life. And then I run into this a lot with my grandsons, the idea of video games, entertainment, and streaming, and that's not just my grandsons, but the base and self-gratifying options that are so wrapped up in things like TikTok and all of the different media forms that bring garbage, self-gratifying garbage directly into our lives. And then along with this opiate-rich environment, there is the part of us that wants to have escape addictions. It's a way that we escape. It's a way that we numb ourselves. And sometimes it covers up our self-loathing. The things that we don't like about being human, the things that we don't like about being ourselves. And then finally, that opiate-rich environment, the idea of cultivation and the pursuit of self-obsession is an opiate. Just like I think religion can be an opiate. It's why I'm kind of I'm anti-religious. I'm totally prone to relationship. King first, then kingdom, then church. And when I'm reading through a history book right now of church history, and it's in one volume, and it's got all of this artwork in it, whatever, I look at it and I think, there's so much stuff in that, in our history, that is so bogus. So that's also one of the opiates of the nations, which a famous person that I'm not going to quote right now brought up at one point. So I say all of that to think about this idea of being awake and being alive, and the idea that we are in the midst of this reality where there is light and there is darkness. There are things that we are awake to, and there are things that we are asleep to. And there's this verse that it took me years to ponder and contemplate it. It's in the book of Ephesians. It says, "For this reason," it says, and you can look at that context if you ever want to, "Awake, sleeper, and arise from the dead, and Christ will shine on you." And this is obviously talking about people who were asleep, not just in the sleep of death, but in the sleep of, walking death, like a lot of people experience. And basically, that's the nature of what Jesus was trying to do. He was trying to bring people out of darkness and bring us into the light and help us to awaken and to raise up from this walking dead. And as that process happens, the light shines on us, and that's Christ, or that's Messiah, and it's the light of God, and it's illuminating God and who God is. So I don't know if that's helpful to you. There are a lot of things that could be said about awakening. I return to my initial slide. I think there are things that need to be recovered that have been lost, and I'm hopeful for that. I'm sure there are parts of me that need to be revived and need to be brought back because of the things that I've experienced in life and learned in life. So I get that, and I can embrace that. And then also, I'm open not just to the idea of revival, but also of waking up, awakening to things that I've never seen before, never found before. And I think this is what our neighbors need so desperately, is to wake up and rise from the dead so Christ can shine on us, so we can begin to become everything that we were meant to be. And then the whole idea about the early rains and the later rains, and how, I'm looking out my windows right now and it's snowing and it's a beautiful snowfall and I'm distracted, but I think about, I have no control over the snow and the rain and the sun and the different things that foster and bring about life. I mean, I can control things in my cubicle, in my house, in my part of the world, but rain involves God-reliant things, and I want to be awake to that. I want to experience the light that comes from my Creator, and the rain that comes down from heaven, and that brings nourishment, not just to me and to my life, but to people around me. And when I think about the suffering that is in the world and the need that is in the world around me, I just think about how desperately we need to awake, sleeper, rise from the dead, and Christ, Messiah, will shine on you. There you go. Next time, maybe we'll talk about Lady Wisdom. She's pretty awesome.
Thanks for listening to our podcast. You can find posts and podcasts on tons of subjects at Fourthstream.com, along with encouraging music which can be shared by a variety of ages. Finding hope at Fourthstream.com.